Today's daf we're going to be learning is Sanhedrin daf samach. It's the daf for Shabbat. We are going to get started at the bottom of Nun Tet Amud Bet. Rabbi Shimon Omer Afalak Kishuv. So we're going to finish up this issue of the Noahide laws, and perhaps specifically didn't call them the seven because we learned now that maybe there's other ones, not just those seven. Rabbi Shimon adds Afalak Kishuv, even for sorcery. My time of Rabbi Shimon, where does he get this from? The juxtaposition of these two verses in Shemot chapter 22 of not allowing witches to stay alive, meaning we have to destroy them, and anyone who engages in bestiality will be killed. So we say anyone who's part of that is also part of that. And since we already know in Giloy Arayot, not allowed all sorts of inappropriate relations, one of them including bestiality, which is part of the mitzvot of Bnei Noach. Therefore, also, we're going to say that machshefa, engaging in sorcery, is also forbidden to Bnei Noach. Rabbi Eliezer, when we're afala kilayim, he says, in addition, also kilayim. And kilayim is basically this idea of trying to be God, mixing breeds together and trying to create new things, kind of act as if we're God, which makes sense then that it would be part of the Noahide laws. Where do we get this from? So again, we have to find some sort of source in the Torah. So they say, well, it says at the beginning of the pasuk all about kilayim, mixed breeds. It says, keep my statutes. So it says, don't crossbreed animals. Don't plant in your fields kilayim. And don't wear shatnez clothing. So how do they understand it from this pasuk? It has to do with Bnei Noach. It says, keep my statutes, but it says, my statutes you should keep. Which statutes? The ones I already told you about before, meaning before you got the Torah to Noach, Noach was commanded these things. Now, we're going to learn one other thing between the words in this pasuk. Which parts of kilayim are they commanded? Not actually everything. Well, the animal and the field, just like animals, what is it? Taking two animals, mating them together to create a new type. Also, your field, it's when you do harkava, when you graft trees together, and it's only trees. It's not normally in the Torah. What's forbidden is also planting your vineyard near your grains. Even though you're not actually trying to create something new, you're just planting them in close proximity to each other. That's not going to be forbidden. What's going to be forbidden is actually creating something new that will be also long-lasting, which is trees, grafting of trees. Another comparison they make here, just like your animal, it doesn't matter whether you're in the land of Israel or not in the land of Israel, right? To crossbreed two animals is a problem everywhere. So you might have thought your field, because a lot of mitzvot are connected to fields, specifically in Israel. Maybe it's a problem only in Israel. Well, it teaches you even outside of Israel, it's a problem. Wait a minute. They say, hold off. You're going to say, because it says keep my statutes, that it's going to mean anything that all of what I'm commanding you is already forbidden to Bnei Noach? Well, let's take this very general pasuk, which relates to all mitzvot in the Torah. Okay, it's a very famous pasuk. It says you should keep my statutes and my laws. Asher yaseh otam adam, that the man will do, v'chai behem, and live. We should live by them. Ani Hashem, meaning you should live by them and not die by them. Famous pasuk, and we're going to get to this pasuk later in the Masachet. Wait a minute. You're going to say all the mitzvot in the Torah were already given to Bnei Noach? That's obviously not possible. So if there it says ushmartem chukotai, and by us it says chukotai tishmoru, well, wouldn't you learn it's the same thing? Which the Gemara says, hatam ushmartem chukotai dehashta. There, notice the words are in the different order. There it starts with the word observe. Observe the commandments. What commandments? The ones I'm going to give you now. Hacha, but in our pasuk it said, et chukotai, those statutes you already got, tishmoru, observe. The observe comes at the end of the phrase. So chukim demikar, tishmoru, that means keep the ones that I already told you before. Okay, it's just the order of where chukim is in the verse. It's not the most convincing answer, but it does allow for the world of drasha to come up with differentiations. Amar Rabbi Yoshua ben Korcha. Now we're back to the Mishnah. The Mishnah maybe we'll just read the whole Mishnah because on this Amud, we're going to darshan all the different parts of this Mishnah. So the Mishnah back on Nun He Amud Bet was talking about someone who curses God, who gets stoned. So according to the first line in the Mishnah, you have to actually curse God. And you have to explicitly say God's name. Amar Rabbi Shimon ben Korcha said, "B'chol yom danim et ha'edim b'kinoi." When we talk about it in the court and the witnesses come forward and say, so-and-so, curse God, they don't say curse God, saying God's name. They don't say exactly what they said, but they say Yakeh Yasi Yasi, right? Which is like a code name for he cursed God. Nigmar Hadin, once though they conclude this person is guilty, lo horgim bekinoi elamotzim, and as you can't kill by just saying the guy said he cursed God, but without really saying God's name. So what do? Motziim et kol adam l'chut, to get everybody out of the room. You don't want them all to hear this. Sho'alim et hagadol shebenhem, you leave in the witnesses, and you ask the most prominent one. V'omer lo amor ma sheshamata beferush, and they say, tell us exactly what you heard. And he says it. The dayanim are standing, and they tear their clothes, and they don't fix the garment. And the other witnesses just say, yeah, I agree with what he said. They don't actually say it again because we don't want anyone to say the words, right? Curse, the person said this. It's like not saying a curse word, like they say so-and-so cursed, and you don't want to say, oh, this is what they said, because you don't want to say the curse word. Same idea. Obviously different, right? But here we're using God's name, which is all the more so holy. It's, the opposite, but sanctified and holy. And we don't want to say it with cursing God. So now Rabbi Eliezer says, Rabbi Shimon ben Korcha says, okay, if you remember, what did he say? He said, you say it bekinoi, yas yakeh yasi yasi. So on Rav Acha bar Yaakov, enu chayav ad shivarech shem ben arba otiyot. Rav Acha bar Yaakov says the only time you're liable for this kind of thing is if you use the name of God that has 4 letters, meaning the Yud Kei Vav Kei. Lafuke shem ben shtei otiyot delo. What's he trying to tell us? That it's not the name of God with 2 otiyot, which is the first 2 Yud Hey. Okay, not that. That's not, if you shouldn't do it, but you won't get the death penalty for that. Pshita, Yakeh Yasi Yasi Tana. Isn't this obvious from the Mishnah? It says Yasi Yasi, and I don't know if you paid attention. Yasi is 4 letters, and the idea is that Yasi is a reference to the Yud Kei Vav Kei. No, the Mishnah, you might have thought the Mishnah was just using it as an example and just randomly took a name, Yasi, but didn't necessarily mean that that's representative of the 4-letter name of God, and therefore Rav Acha needed to tell you this. But some people have a different version of this. So this was to say Rav Acha was saying 4 and not the 2-letter name. 2-letter name, you won't be liable. Some people say, that of the 4-letter name of God is also considered a name. In other words, what happened? The Mishnah said, until you say the shame, right? You have to say the shame of God, right? That was the first line. Ad shifaresh Hashem. What does Hashem mean? They say it means the 4-letter name also. Also what? We're going to see. So Pshita, Yakeh Yasi Yasi Tan. Obviously the 4-letter name is the name of God because it says Yasi et Yasi, which again, 4 letters. So they say, again, this is just a different version of that same conversation. So it makes sense they're using some of the same arguments. They say, Ma'u detema adi ika shem rabba, umilta ba'almahu tenaka kamash malan. You might have thought it's until you use the long name of God. Now, God has a name that's 42 letters long. Maybe you would need to use that name to get the death penalty of stoning. So, and then you would say Yasi Yasi was just a random use of a name. It was just randomly they chose that name. It doesn't necessarily mean that it was to represent the 4 letters. And therefore, Kamash Malan, that's why Rav Acha has to come teach you also the 4-letter name. Now, instead of the first version where it was the 4, not the 2, this is saying the 42 and also the 4-letter name of God. Now, obviously, it's excluding the 2. It's just a matter of where you're coming from about what the uniqueness of the 4-letter name we're trying to say. First one is it's obvious it's included, but coming to say not the 2-letter name. And the other is, it's not necessarily obvious. Maybe it's only the 42-letter name, but it's also the 4. Nigmar Hadin. And then it said the judges stand up, right? When the person then says, the witness comes and said, this is what I heard him say, and then recites it word by word, they tear their garments, okay? But they also stand. Omdim minalan. So first we're going to deal with the standing, then we'll get to the tearing. Amar Rav Yitzchak bar Ami de Amar Kra ve'ehud ba'elav. It's a bit of a strange place to learn it. You'll see why in a minute. Ehud is one of the shoftim, one of the judges in the book of Judges, and he goes to Eglon, the king of Moab, and he says to him, "V'hu yoshev b'aliyat ha'makareh asher lo levado." He was sitting in this area. Vayomer Ehud dvar Elohim li elecha. He says, "I have the word of God to tell you." Vayakam me'ala kisei, and immediately the king gets up. So now they say what? Halo dvarim kavachomer. Umay lo melech Moab shu nochri v'lo yada lebekinoi. Melech Moab is not Jewish, and he only knows God's name by kinoi, by what people call the name of God, but not the real Shema Mefurash. And yet Amad, and yet he stood up. Yisrael v'Shema Mefurash alacha kama v'kama. The Jews, right? If it's a Jewish person saying it, and it's the special name of God, all the more so you would have to stand up. So we're basically learning it from Eglon, the king of Moab. Very interesting. The fact that he stood up obviously means we have to stand up. Interesting. Often we make this comparison, like Halavai, all of us Jews had the same respect that sometimes other outside people have for Judaism or, for certain things. And, sometimes we just are used to things. We don't even take them seriously anymore. And it's a good reminder, that if other people take it seriously, all the more so we should be taking it seriously. Korim minalan. So now how do we get that we rend our garments? Dichtiv vayavo Eliakim ben Chilkiyahu v'Shevna Sofer v'Yoach ben Asaph HaMaskil el Chizkiyahu ku'e b'gadim v'yagidu lo et divrei Rav Shakeh. We get back to Shevna and Chizkiyahu, which we learned a bunch about them in this Masechet. If you remember, what happens is Rav Shakeh is from the Assyrian kingdom. He's the head of the army. He does a siege around the city, and he stands by the walls of the city, and he says, curses God. And then Shevna and these other characters come to Chizkiyahu, torn with rending garments. So, and then they tell him what Rav Shakeh said. Lo ma'achim minan. Okay, so that's how we get. They came to him with torn clothing. So now they ask, Lo ma'achim minan. How do we know that you can't fix your garments? So for that, Rabbi Yavau, Atya kri'a kri'a. We're going to do a gzera shava from these people who had torn clothing to ktiv hacha. So ktiv hacha kru'e b'gadim. That's what it says by us in Rav Shakeh. Uktiv hatam, when Eliyahu dies or kind of goes up in his chariot, Elisha ro'eh v'hu mitza'ek avi avi rechav Yisrael u'parashav. Very famous line. My father, in the chariot of Yisrael. V'lo ra'ahu od. And he doesn't see him after that. Vayachazak b'begadav. The pasuk continues. He grabs onto his clothing. Vayikraim l'shnayim kraim, and he tears them into two tears. Mimashma shneimar vayyikraim l'shnayim ein yodei Hashem kraim. It says Vayikraim l'shnayim kraim. Why doesn't it just say Vayikraim l'shnayim? He tore it in two. You don't have to say he tore it into two tears. That's weird. So Matamud Lamar, why does it say kraim? Melamed shehem kruim la'olam. It teaches you that they remained torn forever. And since Elisha's remained torn forever, and it had the root likra, to tear, and the kru'e b'gadim had the same root there, we're going to learn from one to the other that when you hear someone cursing God, you tear it forever. Tanu Rabbanit. Echad hashomea ve'echad hashomea mipi shomea. One who hears someone curse God, and one who hears someone else who tells about someone they heard cursing God. Chayav likra. How do we know? Well, that's our case. Okay, right? That exactly means our case. When the Adam came and said, we heard this person curse God and said the following words, when the one witness says it, they tear their garments, the judges. But notice who doesn't. Ha'idim ein chayavim likra. So the Braita points out, the witnesses themselves don't need to rend their garments. Because they already rended them earlier when they heard him curse the first time. And not when they don't need to do it again when someone recounts the story. So what if they tore it then? They're hearing it now. So don't you think they would have to also do it now? Lo sakadatach. We don't think so. Why? Because look, where did we learn this whole thing from? The people who came who were kru'e b'gadim. So let's see the story. It says, just lost my place. Okay. Lo sakadatach tichtiv. Vayhi kishma hamelech Chizkiyahu. When Chizkiyahu heard what Rav Shakeh said, he rended his garments. Hamelech Chizkiyahu kara, vehem lo karu. But look, pay attention. Who did it? Chizkiyahu, not the other people who came and said what Rav Shakeh did. So then when they recounted it, they already had torn their garments. They don't need to do it again. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel. Rav Yehuda is going to pass down two halachot in the name of Shmuel, and then we're going to say that this disagrees, both these halachot disagree with what Rabbi Chia says. Hashomea azkara mipi hagoy eno chayav lekra. If you hear a Gentile cursing God, you don't have to tear your garments. We're going to have a big problem because Rav Shakeh, that was the whole source came from a Gentile. So we'll get back to this. And va'amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel ein kolim ela al shema miyuchad bilvado. Okay, and you only do it if you hear someone curse in the Shema Mefurash. That's like what Rav Acha said. So now they say, La'afuke midarabi la'afuke kinoi delo. Okay, meaning he's coming to exclude kinoi, that if you use a nickname of God, it doesn't work, right? Meaning it doesn't work, it means you curse God, but you're not going to get punished to the death penalty. Upliga Rabbi Chia b'travayu, and he disagrees with Rabbi Chia on both those counts. Now, you'll see that Rabbi Chia is not going to exactly say what he said, but you'll see they're going to explain why it's clear that Rabbi Chia disagrees on both counts, or that Shmuel disagrees with Rabbi Chia on both these counts. Da'amar Rabbi Chia, Hashomea azkara b'zman hazeh eno chayav likra. If you hear someone cursing God nowadays, says Rabbi Chia, in his day, you don't need to rend your garments. Why is that? Well, you really should, but if you don't say that, if we make you rend your garments, everybody's garments are going to be completely torn, okay, in a million places. Meaning, because people are cursing all the time. Now, Miman, who's cursing all the time? Mami Yisrael, if you're going to say it was Jews cursing, like Shmuel says, Mi pakir kulehai, mi pakire kulehai. The Jews aren't cursing God all the time. You're not going to have rending garments because you keep hearing Jews curse God. Elapshita migoy. Must be, it's Gentiles. And ish shema miyuchad, migamire. If you say it's only the shema miyuchad, well, the Gentiles don't know the shema miyuchad. Elalav bekinoi. It must be bekinoi. Ushma mina. We can learn from here. Bisman azehu delo. Hami ikara chayav. Shma mina. Okay, and if you say not, sorry, I just got to sidetrack because I realized I skipped a line, but we'll go back to that in 1 minute. Shma mina bisman azehu delo. Hami ikara chayav. Right. Now, remember, what did he say? It's now that today, nowadays you don't rend your garments, but it obviously implies that you should. You should, just it's a problem. No one's going to have any clothes to wear. They're going to be fully torn. Okay, and they can't just go buy new clothes every day. So that shows that he disagrees both on the Gentile and both on the Shema Miyuchad. Now I skipped the important line about Rav Shakeh. I told you we were going to get to. Somehow missed it. If we go back for a minute, I'm Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel. What about Rav Shakeh? He wasn't Jewish. He wasn't Jewish. So how can you say that? Yisrael Mumar Hayat. The Gemara assumes that Rav Shakeh was a Jew who basically left religion. Now, in Judaism, there's no such thing as leaving the religion, so he might have declared himself not Jewish, but technically speaking, he's still Jewish, and therefore it was a Jew who they rented their garments for, who was cursing God. Where we get that Rav Shakeh was a mumar sounds like we get it from here, really. And some commentaries talk about how he also spoke Hebrew to them. So the fact he spoke Hebrew perhaps was an indication that his background was Jewish. Why else would he know Hebrew? It's an interesting question. And this is the source for it. Like if you look up about Rav Shakeh, they'll say, oh, yeah, some people say he was a mumar and he was really Jewish, but left the religion, and it's based on this Gemara. Okay. Hashini Omer Afani Kamohu. Now the second witness comes and says, oh yeah, I say like him, meaning he doesn't repeat the whole thing again because we don't want people cursing, saying so-and-so cursed God. We don't want to hear that phrase of saying God is cursed. So now Amarish Lakish Mamina, he says, you know what we can refer from here? Afani Kamohu Kasher B'dinei Mamonot B'dinei Nefashot. Now in general in testimony, we don't let you say, oh yeah, I say like him. They make the witnesses say the whole testimony on their own. So comes Rish Lakish and says the fact that we make an exception to the rule here shows that really it works. If you just say, oh yeah, me like him, I agree with what he said, that actually, technically speaking, by Torah law would be accepted by the court. In Dinei Mamonot and Dinei Nefashot, because this is a capital case. Uma'alahu da'aviv Rabbanit. But the rabbis made a higher standard. But here, but since here we have some other pulling issue, so we basically allow you to, we say doraita. We say we go back to the original Torah law and allow people to say, oh yeah, and I just agree with him. Because if you said it doesn't work, if you say, well, just because we can't, if in a case where it wouldn't be permitted to do on a Torah level, we're going to kill somebody. Has to be to kill somebody, to execute this person, convict them in court and execute them. You need proper proof. And if I say like him doesn't work, then there's no way we would be killing this person. Last line before we get to the next Mishna, the Shiur ani af kamohu. I agree with him, right? Third one also. Rabbi Akiva de makish l'shnayim. This Mishnah must be like Rabbi Akiva, who basically says that the third witness is considered like the other two for all sorts of issues, right? If there's a problem with the third witness, we don't say, oh, we have another two. We view them as one group, and therefore whatever is true for the second will be true for the third, and that's why the Mishnah goes to the third. Okay, turning now to the Amud and the new Mishnah. Now we're moving to Oved Avodah Zarah, someone who worships idols. Echad HaOved, one who worships the idol. Echad HaMizabech, one who sacrifices to the idol. Okay, already the first question of the Gemara is going to be, what does it mean to worship the idol? Because we're going to go through all types of methods of worshiping. So what is Oved? Oved is just a general term for everything. So yes, in the topic sentence, Oved Avodah Zarah means if you worship idols, but then it says Echad Oved, Echad HaMizabech, and starts listing all these actions. What could Oved be? Isn't that how do you worship the idol if not in all these other ways? And that's going to be something we're going to deal with in the Gemara. Echad one who slaughters an animal for the idol. Echad if you offer up an incense or burning something. Echad someone who pours a libation. Echad whether you bow down. Echad alav le'eloha, if you accept him as your God. Ha'omer lo eliata, if you say you are my God. Ava. Okay, now those are all in one category. We're going to see later what the difference between this category and the other category is. Ava hamigapef, if you hug it. Haminashake, you kiss the idol. Hamechabed, you sweep it. Hamirabetz, you pour water to clean it. Hamirachetz, you wash it. Right, mirabetz was this way they would spritz water on, particularly like on floor. This could be also you're cleaning the area around it. The floors were all made of dirt, so they would spill water in order to have the dust settle down. If you wash it, hasach, you anoint it, you put creams on it, hamalbish, you dress it, hamanil, you put shoes on it, over below tase. That's only a negative commandment. You're not going to get the death penalty for those actions. Hanoder b'shmo, v'amakayem b'shmo, over below tase. If you swear in its name or take an oath in its name, then it's also a negative commandment. Hapoer atzmo lebal pa'ol. Oh, zohi avodatah. This was a very strange thing they would do to Baal Peor. The way you worship Baal Peor is you would pull down your pants and you would defecate in front of the god. That was the way they worshipped it. So if you do that, that's forbidden, specifically to Baal Peor. And azorek even lemarkulis zohi avodatat. Markulis was a god that they would throw stones at him. That was the way they worshipped it. So if you do that, that's the way to worship that idol. You're liable. Obviously, if you throw stones at Baal Peor, or you defecate in front of Markulis or some other idol, you're not going to be liable. Now that we asked the question, I said we were going to ask Mayachad Hoveh. What does that mean? One who worships. Rabbi Yirmiyah Hachi Kamar. Rabbi Yirmiyah says this is what it means. Echad Hoveh Kedarka, ve'echad Mizabech, ve'echad Mekater, ve'echad Menasech, ve'echad Mishtachaveh, afilu shelo kedar. Now we're going to make a split between the first one and all the others. Oved means you worshipped an idol according to the way that it's worshipped. This is kind of similar to the end of the Mishnah, where if each idol has its own. Now, the Mishnah kind of said at the end a few other types, but when it means you worshipped, it means you worship that idol in the way it's supposed to be worshipped. What if you have an idol that's not generally worshipped by slaughtering animals, but you slaughtered an animal to them? So now we go to the next list, which is Mizabach, Bikater, Menasech, Mishtachaveh. Those four, slaughtering an animal, offering incense, pouring a libation, and bowing, even if that's not the way generally that idol is worshipped, since that's a general way of worshiping, and we're going to see what makes all those actions unique, you're going to be liable. We haven't seen yet why, but we'll get there in a minute. Now the Gemara says, wouldn't you think also throwing the blood, like sprinkling the blood from the slaughtered animal, because that's like the main way we worship God, wouldn't you think that would also be in all cases? To which Amar Abaye, Zorek Hanu Menasech. Yeah, it is included. It's just part of libations, because what does a libation mean? It means pouring on blood, pouring on wine, whatever it might be. And here we have a pasuk to support that, which has to do with pouring libations, and it says libations of blood. So there you see this connection of libations with blood. Okay, so zorek is included. It's just not included as a separate word because it's included within the Nasech. Now we want to know Manan Mile. How do we know that these things are forbidden, even if it's not the general way of worshiping? Did Tanu Rabbanit. Now we're going to darshan this pasuk in Shmot Kafbet. Zovech leElohim yecheram. If you slaughter an animal to gods, you will be yecheram, like cherem, which really means, according to the Torah, you're going to be killed. Bilti Hashem levado. You can only worship God. So now they're going to darshan this. Zovech yecheram. Ilu ne'amal zovech yecheram. This is a braita. That's what Tanu Rabbanan. It's a midrash halacha style braita. Ilu ne'amar zovech yecheram. If it had said zovech yecheram, someone who slaughters will be killed. Without the word leElohim. They try to think, what else could that have meant? Well, there's a time when you slaughter an animal. If you slaughter a sacrifice outside the temple, you also get killed. You actually get curried. Okay, we'll get back to that. But you might have thought it was talking about that. Talmud Lomar, meaning not having anything to do with idols. Talmud Lomar, leElohim, it had to say to other gods so that you know they were talking about to other gods. Well, that tells us, okay, slaughtering. We got slaughtering. Mikater, and that would mean also any time, whether you're doing it, whether it's the typical way or not the typical way of worshiping this idol. Mikatero menasech minai. And how do we get two of the others on the list? Offering incense and pouring a libation or blood. Talmud Lomar, Bilti Hashem levado. What does that mean? Only for God, meaning Riken avodot kulam l'shem miyuchad. It emptied the avodot only for God, meaning whatever you do for God, which is basically slaughtering, offering the blood, the libations, and the ketoret, incense, you cannot do for Elilim. So even though it just said Zoveach, it means anything that's like Zoveach, which is going to mean, and only things you do for God. So that's only going to include actions you do to God. Right? For example, you can already see that excludes kissing and hugging, like that's not part of our worship in the temple. Okay, so now they say, right, because zvicha is now separated out to teach you about avodot pnim. So that teaches you anything that was done inside in the temple for God is basically forbidden to do for idols, no matter what, whether it's the regular way of worshiping or not. How do you know bowing, though? In other words, we have a general don't worship idols, but then it specifies zevach, which is slaughtering, and that's going to say everything that's like slaughtering that's done inside. But what about bowing? We don't usually bow. I mean, there is some bowing in the temple, but it's not part of the usual worship. Talmud Lomar, a different pasuk, and now we're going to Sefer Dvarim. This is talking about a person who goes and decides to worship idols, and he bows to them. And then two psukim later, it says, you're going to take this person out, and the end of that pasuk is, you're going to stone that person. So, there you see bowing, because it says bowing in the pasuk, and it says stoning. Okay, onesh shamanu asara minai, and that's very nice. It says the punishment, but we know we've talked about this with the arayot. For every punishment, you have to have a warning. Don't do this. Where does it say don't bow? Talmud lamar ki lo tshachavela el nichal. Okay, this is in Shmot chapter 34. Right, it says don't bow down to idols. Okay, that's pretty clear. Wait a minute, but you might think that this includes all kinds of anything you do for a god. It could be the sweeping, the hugging, the kissing, all that, dressing. Talmud Lomar, Zoveach, okay, so now again, we're going to go back. We're going to say no, because Zoveach, we're a little circular here. We're repeating things, but Zvicha bichlal, remember, it was just a general, don't worship idols. And then we specify one action of slaughtering. Lama yatzat, why is it exception to the rule? Why is it specify, really, they want to say? In order to make this comparison, we're just repeating. Just like slaughtering is something you do inside, and you get death penalty for it if you worship it, if you do it for idols. All the things we do inside the temple that are considered ways of worship, and then you will get death penalty for these as well if you do them for idols. And then, now here's the summary pasuk, we have ishtachavaya specifically to teach just bowing. And yatsa zvicha, this is total repeat, zvicha is also specified lidona laklal kulo, to teach about the general rule. Okay, and that's why we end up from Zvicha, we get to everything done inside, Ishtachavaya just for itself, and all the others stand alone, and they aren't the same. They're not in that same category. You don't get the death penalty, and you don't, it's only if you do them, right? You only get the death penalty if they're the particular way that you worship that idol. Amar, two more quick things for the end of the stuff. So now we're quoting this pasuk in this line. I would have thought you meant shchutei chutz. So the Gemara is going to say, why would you have thought that? Now, not because why would you have thought that, but there's a problem. You get karet, you don't get killed. And this says yecharam, which sounds like the court kills you. Yet we didn't necessarily know that till we saw them say it, but that's what they're assuming. And karet is in the hands of God. Wait, you might have thought it is karet, but that's when you're not warned or you don't have witnesses. But when you're warned and you have witnesses, maybe you would get stoned. That's why in the end it teaches you no. It had to say Elohim so that you wouldn't think that. Because Kodshim really, you don't get stoned and karet. You only get karet, stoned or karet. But no, you just get karet, no stoning. Amalei Rava Barav Hanan la'Abaye. Ema yatzai ishtachavaya lelamed ala klal kulo. So now we said, right, why don't we say the ishtachavaya, maybe ishtachavaya really did come to teach about everything else. Anything you do for idols besides all the avodot done inside, right? Maybe ishtachavaya is the paradigm for everything. Ishtachavaya, you get stoned, everything you get stoned. Whether you did it as its worship, whether you did it just for the idol, anything you do. And then you'll say, well, then why does it say zoveach? Maybe it's used legufe. We're going to end with this question. Maybe it's used for itself, meaning maybe zoveach is coming to teach you something else. What would it teach you? What does that mean? Let's say I slaughter an animal, not for the sake of the idol, but I have in my mind, and this is something that works in the temple, this thing about what you're thinking at the time. That's what pigul is. We'll get to this. Like if you're thinking at the time that you slaughter, you're doing the slaughter perfectly well, but you think I'm going to sprinkle the blood tomorrow, which you can't do. You have to sprinkle the blood that day. It's pigul, that you've destroyed the korban because of your thoughts. So now, perhaps the word zoveach, Elohim yacharam, is coming to teach you if I slaughter it for the right, I'm just slaughtering an animal, but I have in mind, not that I'm slaughtering this animal for this God, but that I'm going to sprinkle the blood for this God, meaning I'm thinking mechashvim avodah means while I'm doing this action, I'm thinking about a different action, that action later I'm going to do for the idol. Right now I'm not doing it for the idol, but later action I am going to do for the idol. Or, you're thinking I'm going to take the body and burn it on the altar or something. Then that is forbidden. And that's what Zoveach is going to come teach you about that halacha. And then we're going to get into this Itmar, this Bachlig, between Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Rish about this issue, and we're going to continue this discussion in tomorrow's daf. Okay, so what did we do today? We finished up the Bnei Noach about the extras of the Kishuf and the kilayim. We saw the source in the Torah and a bit of a limitation on the kilayim on what's forbidden for Bnei Noach, according to Rabbi Eliezer. Then we went back to this whole thing about saying the name of God and saying the person cursed God, and reciting it in the court. And when you do that, all sorts of things happen. Judges have to stand because you're saying the God's name. We talked about what name of God you actually have to use in order to get convicted. We talked about the tearing of the garments then that has to happen, and that you can't ever fix them, and where we learn all that from. And then who has to rend their garments in the court? The people already heard it at the time of the action. They don't necessarily have to rend their garments again. Then we had this thing about the witnesses being able to say, oh yeah, me like him, we don't want to repeat God's name. And that teaches us that really, ideally by Torah law, it's actually okay to do that, even though the rabbis instituted that in general that you have to say explicit testimony. From there, we got to the new Mishna of Oved Avodah Zarah and all the actions that are forbidden. And we divided them into kind of two different categories, things that are specifically to that worship, right, for that God, or things that are general that are going to be forbidden no matter what. And if it's not the way, right, it's not one of those major actions, and it's not the way you generally worship that God, then any other actions you do, it's just a negative prohibition. It's not actually forbidden by death penalty. And then we saw the sources for all that. And with that, we're going to finish for today. Wishing everyone Shabbat Shalom and Shavua Tov.